this weekend, I got a little bit of an insight as to how Baldur's Gate 3 wins Game of the Year polls on message boards and on like smaller YouTube channels. Obviously, I can't speak as to what's happening in gaming journalism circles, but I think it's the same kind of thing here, where relatively unbiased sources will give the award to something like Tears of the Kingdom or some other Nintendo game, while heavily controlled biased ones will give it to Baldur's Gate 3. And we saw this today when it comes to the Emperor's Game of the Year poll, where like he has a Game of the Year selection open to the public, right? I shared it on my YouTube channel, and it was interesting, when this thing first started, and Baldur's Gate 3 went up against Pikmin 4, right? And of course, Pikmin 4 like got off to a massive lead, right? I shared the image, I laughed about it, and some time passed, and Baldur's Gate 3 won, right? But like the thing is, the lead between Pikmin 4 and Baldur's Gate 3 was so large when I first saw it that I knew something was up. So, I checked certain sources. I looked around a bit and I noticed that this particular poll was being reposted on Reddit. It was being reposted on Discord. It was being reposted on YouTube, like telling people go to this poll and vote for Baldur's Gate 3, right? Baldur's Gate 3 fans were trying to rally to vote for a completely, well, I hate saying completely irrelevant, but for a YouTuber's Game of the Year poll in order to like own the haters, to own Black Cat Book 64, to own Harmon Smith, to give him an L. And what happens? Like Baldur's Gate 3 gets stomped, by Metroid Prime Remastered, of all things, and then that gets stomped by Tears of the Kingdom, which wins the entire thing, right? So it's like, okay, what exactly did you accomplish here? Okay, you beat Pikmin 4 in a tournament bracket, like big whoop, right? And you had to rally to do it. Like it was such a crazy thing to see happen live. How insistent they were about like rallying for Baldur's Gate 3, how they posted it on all these different outlets, how they tried getting people to care about this random poll, but yeah, it just didn't work. Like in the end, Baldur's Gate 3 simply wasn't popular enough, right? The better games won out, and they had to rig the vote against Pikmin 4. It only lost by like 1%. It was pretty close. So like it was it was crazy seeing these people try and come out and try to like release some statements, like try and say that like, oh, Baldur's Gate 3 is going to win the entire thing. No, it's not. Baldur's Gate 3 has not really won any Game of the Year award because nobody outside of its circle of diehard fans really acknowledges it as something worth talking about at all, right? We're in 2024 now. Like we're in the next year. Like the current year is the year following the one that Baldur's Gate 3 came out in. And much like Dragon Age Inquisition, much like Overwatch, much like The Last of Us Part 2, right? Other Game of the Year winners, the game immediately starting the new year has been completely forgotten. Unless you're a PC gamer trying to get one up on console players, particularly Nintendo fans, like you don't care about Baldur's Gate 3 at all because it wasn't that great of a game. It didn't keep people invested all that much. People didn't keep playing it. People finished it in like a weekend or whatever and then just moved on to something else. Anybody saying they put 300 hours into it or that like it has 300,000 players on Steam is full of crap. Okay? Like that's not true at all, right? It doesn't it's just a cope. Like I'm seeing people say that like the game has sold like 34 million copies or some shit. Like, okay, like if Baldur's Gate 3 really sold that many copies, why is Larian not coming out and contesting Hogwarts Legacy claim, Avalanche's claim that Hogwarts Legacy is the best-selling game of this year? of 2023, right? The preceding year. Like, why is Larian not coming out and disputing that, right? Why did nobody come out and dispute that? Or why did no one dispute the numbers that came out in those sale charts? Why are people not claiming that Baldur's Gate 3 outsold Call of Duty or Zelda or Starfield? Like, where are the actual numbers? Okay, why is no one giving me a hard number for Baldur's Gate 3 sales? Why are people not telling me like the exact numbers so we can see what Baldur's Gate 3 is selling? And the reality is it's not that big of a deal. Okay, considering the genre, considering the audience, considering the PC gaming community, like this thing probably sold less than like 10 million. I would put it under 8 million personally. Like Dragon Age Inquisition, which I think was a lot more ambitious than this, like that sold like 5 million. And that's probably generous considering how unpopular that game was. I saw a lot of people in my comment section talking about that, bringing up how like the game was on sale a lot and like how it was pushed onto people and how like it was completely forgotten. Like plenty of players only put like an hour into it because it was so terrible. Like that is the implication I get into Baldur's Gate 3. Like I've heard that a lot of people bought this game, expecting it to be something great and then refunded it within like an hour when they realized that like what kind of game it actually was, right? Like I've heard those kind of stories and I believe them. Right? I know people who have given up on playing Baldur's Gate 3, right? Because it isn't all that spectacular, right? There's nothing about this game that really stands the test of time. And I think it's interesting. Why are Baldur's Gate 3 fans not going after Elden Ring fans? Why are Baldur's Gate 3 fans not trying to claim that like, oh, we're better than you, we've sold more? No, like what happens inevitably every single time is that like Baldur's Gate 3 fans almost always go after like Nintendo or maybe to a lesser extent like Starfield, right? Like they're not going after anything that their community, the PC gaming community, would defend, right? If they went after Elden Ring, if they tried to say Baldur's Gate 3 was better than Elden Ring, they would get straight up wrecked. They would be told to like prove it. Elden Ring's available on 5 platforms. Like it probably sold more on PC than Baldur's Gate 3 did, like on all of its available platforms, right? Like that's how bad it was, right? Like there is no way that Baldur's Gate 3 was bigger than Elden Ring. And yet like people didn't bring up the comparison. People didn't bring up that like, Elden Ring was way more popular. It had way more people playing it. It had lots of hype behind it. Meanwhile, Baldur's Gate 3 comes out of nowhere and suddenly it's the best game ever because you can like bang a bear. Like it's like, come on. Nobody bought that. Nobody did. And that becomes more and more apparent like every month. Like we're in January now, halfway through January. It's like what, like 5 months in, just about. Uh, who is talking about Baldur's Gate 3 in 2024 except for people trying to convince you it was better than whatever Nintendo game we're talking about, right? Like it's completely laughable. That is the mindset these people are in, is just weaponizing Baldur's Gate 3 until they have something else they can use to um to downplay whatever major Nintendo game is coming out this year, right? Like it's probably going to be like the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC or whatever. Like it's the same thing we see every game, every gen, right? Like it's probably going to be Dragon's Dogma 2 for a while there. Like I don't see anybody admitting that like Dragon's Dogma was never good, right? It's going to be the same kind of thing where like, ooh, it's dark fantasy, so that makes it better. It's like it's the same thing we've always seen. It's embarrassing. So with that in mind, what can we expect to see in the coming year? Well, first of all, people will still talk about and play and buy Tears of the Kingdom, right? I expect Nintendo will reveal the numbers this holiday season, and it's going to be huge. I could see it like surpassing Hogwarts Legacy, like 25 million units sold. Like I could see this being a big deal, right? It is a highly successful game that I hope more people talk about positively instead of damage controlling all the time they have been. Secondly, what we're going to see is that like um, the Baldur's Gate 3 fans are going to have to move on to the next thing. They can't just keep clinging on to this one game forever, right? Because like people are going to start getting sick of hearing about it, right? They're going to have to like find some other game to pretend is better than Zelda for a year or so, and I think Dragon's Dogma 2 is probably going to be what they go for. But we'll have to see, right? They're gonna try downplaying Nintendo until like they drop dead, right? That's the issue we're having here right now is that these people will not admit Nintendo is superior no matter what, right? Like it's crazy what we have to go through to be taken seriously in this industry. But like, um, um, on the plus side, the positive thing, we won't have to deal with Baldur's Gate 3 anymore. I think it's safe to say that like the Steam has left the ship. Like it's not going anywhere. It's just gonna stay on there. It's gonna stay in place, and everybody on it is just gonna starve to death because everybody saw the distress signal and they just thought they were setting off fireworks, celebrating their 34 million units sold. Right? Like absolute ridiculous. Like there will be no salvaging Baldur's Gate 3. Like I think. I don't think any subsequent game from the company or from D&D is ever going to like reach the same kind of pedigree. I think more and more people are going to start pushing back against it. I think people are going to like as people get more and more familiar with like the CRPG genre, they'll start like condemning certain practices and addressing that like these kind of things aren't as good as real RPGs, Japanese ones. Like there's going to be a lot of coping and seething in the coming years, but I do think it is safe to say at this point that Baldur's Gate 3 has been completely forgotten.